sexuality, and it brings together scholars from across the disciplines, from undergraduates to faculty members, endeavors to translate gender research to broader audiences. And our event today, the War on Drag, is part of that effort. We're extremely pleased to have you join us here today for this important and timely discussion. And we're extremely pleased to have secured such an incredible panel to shed light on very recent, very new, and very troubling developments. Please note that we will be recording today's seminar and we'll be posting it on the Clayman Institute's YouTube channel in the coming days. The link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered, and we'll likely publicize it on social media as well. Let me share a little bit about today's topic. One of the more surprising aspects of recent culture war battles may be the right-wing attacks on drag performers, which are rapidly being codified into law and are frequently presented in tandem with legislative attacks on trans people, especially trans children. How in the age of RuPaul's Drag Race has drag become a political lightning rod yet again? What exactly links attacks on the practice to attacks on trans rights and trans communities? In this Clayman conversation, leading scholars of gender and trans studies will discuss the political urgency of the moment, the historical dimensions of policing sexuality, gender, and race, and opportunities for intervention and disruption. We're thrilled to have, as I mentioned, an incredible lineup of brilliant speakers who will have so much insight to share with us. Let me first introduce our moderator for today, who will then introduce our speakers. The conversation will be moderated by Maura Donegan. Maura is writer in residence here at the Clayman Institute. She's also a very well-known writer covering the intersection of gender and politics and the law. Her criticism, essays, and commentary have appeared in places such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, and Book Forum. She's been an editor at the New Republic and at N+1, and currently writes a column on gender in America for The Guardian. Her first book, Gone Too Far, Me Too and the Future of Feminist Politics, is forthcoming from Scribner. So thank you all again for joining us. If you have any questions for the speakers during the conversation today, you may use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit them at any time. And with that, Maura, I'll hand it over to you.
Adrian, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you all again for coming. And especially, I want to thank our wonderful panel. We have a real murderer's row today, and I'm just thrilled to be able to witness the conversation among these thinkers. So with me here today to discuss the war on drag are Marquise Bey, who is currently assistant professor of Black Studies and Gender Studies, as well as English and Critical Theory at Northwestern University. And they are the author most recently of Black Trans Feminism and System Failure, Essays on Blackness and Cisgender, which were both published in 2022 with Duke University Press. Marquise, thank you for being here. We also have Jack Halberstam, who is the David Feinstein Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance. Halberstam's latest book, out in 2020 from Duke, is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Places Journal awarded Halberstam its Icarus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Halberstam is now finishing a second volume on wildness titled Unworlding, An Aesthetics of Collapse. And Halberstam was recently the subject of a short film titled So We Moved by Adam Pendleton, which played at MoMA in New York City until January 30th, 2022. Jack, thank you so much for being here. Mark Joseph Stern is a senior writer covering courts and the law for Slate magazine. He holds a JD from Georgetown University Law Center and is a member of the Maryland Bar. He's also the author of American Justice 2019, The Roberts Court Arrives, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Mark, I'm really glad to have you. And last but not least, Susan Stryker is Professor Emerita of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona. Since retiring, she has been the Presidential Fellow and Visiting Professor of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at Yale, Barbara Lee Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership at Mills, and Martha Sutton Weeks External Faculty Fellow at Stanford University Humanities Institute. Former executive editor of TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly, she continues to serve as co-editor of the Duke University Press book series Asterisk, Gender, Trans, and All That Comes After. She is the author of Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution, co-editor of the 2-volume Transgender Studies Reader, and the Transgender Studies Reader Remix, as well as co-director of the Emmy-winning documentary film Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. She is currently working to complete her book manuscript, Changing Gender, under contract to Farrar Straus Giroux, and developing a variety of film and television projects. Susan, thank you for being with us as well. So first of all, now that I have all of your very impressive resumes read to our guests, I wanted to ask you guys, Adrian sort of alluded to this in his wonderful introduction, but there's something a little strange about the sort of revisitation of drag by the right as an item of focus of right-wing contempt at a moment when drag had been for the past 10-15 years or so like pretty rigorously incorporated into the straight mainstream. So I wanted to ask you guys, first of all, if anybody is surprised by this new attack on drag that we're seeing. Did you think this was over? Does it seem a little retro at all, or do you see this as of a piece? Should I not be surprised?
Susan, you look like you're gonna jump.
No, I was just wondering, if we were going to go in order or not. But sure, I can jump in. And I know we're all supposed to keep our remarks brief so that we all have time to speak. So I'll try not to lecture or drone on. But I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is there a distinction between transgender self-presentation versus drag as a theatrical art form? And I think yes, it's like drag has really entered the mainstream in recent years. It's something that I think for much of the so-called normie population, it's been completely decoupled from queer and trans subcultures, and that the reason it's being politicized now, I think, doesn't have anything to do with the broader popular acceptance of that. Adrian mentioned RuPaul's Drag Race, but I think it has everything to do with the political ascendancy of a minority of really reactionary, white supremacist, anti-queer political actors, and that the target is not so much drag per se, but it's targeting a population of people imagined to be unwelcome in or unassimilable to our body politic, and that what is at stake for this reactionary minority that is gaining increasing political power, particularly at the state levels in many different states, is the way that I think there's a deep cultural assumption that the appearance of the body matches dominant cultural understandings of what the body's anatomy is, and that deep logic of believing that biological differences anchor us all in our social categories, whether that's racial difference or sex difference. It's that very logic, the logic of what our bodies mean and how they're supposed to be visible to other people, is a really important legacy of what I think of as the injustices that have come out of the long legacy of European world colonization and the existence of chattel slavery that we started to see in the early modern period, a new ideology that imagined bodily difference is something that anchored a person permanently in an unjustly hierarchized social category that is imagined to be unchangeable. And so for contemporary political actors who are anchored in that dominant cultural ideology. It's like, I think the appearance of drag is the thing that explodes that imaginary, or that ideology about the meaning of biological difference and how it's used to rank people and to divide the population into categories that have greater and lesser access to life chances. So yeah, so that's why I think drag is kind of like low-hanging fruit has become something that's been so politicized as we have watched the ascendancy of a really reactionary white supremacist politics.
Marquise, you look like your ears perked up a little bit while Susan was speaking. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much, Susan. I love the kind of a historical framing, the ways that there are certain things that seem or that are imagined to anchor these what ultimately are myths, I think, because I think also this is part of this, at least. There are a number of things happening here, but I think part of this is this concerted and seemingly perpetual attempt to preserve what is ultimately a myth, preserve the myth of there being this kind of this binary normative gendered system that then seems to anchor one's understanding of the world, of one's relationality. And when that thing is fractured, then there feels to be this impending chaos. Hence, then these kind of reactionary measures to kind of stanch out the things that are intimating this fracturing of one worldview. And I think also to the original point of whether we're surprised, and I always have a vexed relationship to being surprised by various kinds of reactionary right-wing kinds of measures, by which I mean, on the one hand, sure, I'm not surprised. I guess I'm a student very much of the kind of history of trans studies, and as well as the history of various kinds of attempts to advance certain kinds of what we might call progressive or radical kinds of lives and life worlds. And these things always happen. And I think I would say always happen in response to this. There's always a backlash to this. This is Susan Faludi's work, of course. But at the same time, I don't think I want to be surprised. And I think what I mean by that is that I think I want to, and perhaps this is just my own bias, but I want to believe in the kind of world or the kind of relationality or the kind of, worldview that this is something that should shock me, or something that should be something that allows me to be surprised or wanting something else from this. So I think the not wanting to be surprised is part of a kind of politics of desiring for a different kind of world to be in existence, I suppose. But ultimately, yeah, I think this is very much an attempted instantiation of a certain kind of normativity that seeks to preserve the myth of kind of two-sex binary, of various kind of gender roles, of I think it's also very much just, I don't want to say plain old, but very much plain old trans antagonism as well, and various kinds of gender transgressions. All those things are in play here, and I imagine we'll talk about all of those in the rest of the conversation. But I'll cede my time to other folks who want to share things.
I will be happy to jump in, and I'll just sort of give what I think is my punchline so that maybe we can bring it into the conversation, which is I agree with Marquise and Susan that, this is very much the product of this new version of right-wing white supremacist populism and a drive towards a kind of conservative politics, all of that. But I actually think that why this issue now is potentially well answered by thinking of this as a war on young people. This is a moment when an enormous number of young people in conservative and Republican and Christian households are coming out to their parents as gay, trans, and non-binary. Large numbers of kids are coming home and telling their parents that they are non-binary. And that suggests to these very conservative parents and lawmakers and politicians that they don't have control of this next generation in the way that they thought they did maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when young people were heavily influenced by their parents and expressed high levels of transphobia and homophobia in the Bible Belt and other areas. I think that if you really investigated the opinions of people around the country, you would find that transphobia and homophobia do not motivate young people in the way that they motivated their parents, partly because they are coming out as trans and non-binary, and partly because they know people who are trans and non-binary. And what's more, they're deeply angry. They're angry at their parents' generation for environmental collapse, for a shitty political system that is no longer democratic, or if it ever was, and for saddling them with massive amounts of debt, despite the fact that their parents did not take on debt necessarily to go to college. So that I would love to talk about a kind of generational split that is motivating a desperate ploy by legislators to push back on what they see as a sea change among young people.
Yeah, I think you guys are all sort of hinting at a bunch of, overlapping phenomena here, which is that, there is, as Susan pointed out, like only very unstable and sort of unsustainable distinctions between drag and this broader spectrum of like transgender and gender non-conforming sort of expressions. And then Jack and Marquise, you both pointed to this like forward-looking sort of future among like young people who have this maybe like optimistic orientation towards gender, or a differently sort of orientation towards gender that is more comfortable with that kind of instability. But I think like Jack's point about young people is really an astute one, because the right has very much couched its attacks on transgender and transgender people and drag performance in the rhetoric of like protecting the children. And I thought, Mark, this might be a great place to bring you in and ask you to give us just a little more context about sort of this right-wing political push and what kind of bills and what kind of rhetoric we've been seeing around drag and trans expression.
Yeah, so of course we've seen these horrible bills banning gender affirming care for minors at first, but then now to adults as well, at least in Missouri, although that law is on hold. And we've seen all kinds of really horrific laws, especially out of places like Florida, where the governor has decided to make the state a laboratory of suppression of LGBTQ rights. And I think I'd just like to focus for now on the way that so many of these laws are designed to suppress free speech and free expression, both for adults and for children. And I think, some of this is pretty obvious and in the news all the time, the banning of books in school libraries, for instance, and like very mainstream normal books that talk about slavery, books that talk about colonialism, books that involve mild emotional distress. These sort of vigilante groups are going around and forcing school libraries to ban them. And the goal here is to prevent children from accessing different ideas through literature, prevent them from hearing different views, and try to give the state a monopoly on what they are hearing in school. And then on the other side of that, we have things like the Don't Say Gay bill, which bars, it's a very poorly and vaguely written bill, but basically it bars teachers in public schools now at all grades from discussing or instructing on LGBTQ issues. And that potentially includes even acknowledging the existence of LGBTQ people or LGBTQ families. You might not be able to teach about Alan Turing because he was gay, and talking about that could run afoul of the law. And the way this law is enforced is through a vigilante mechanism that allows any parent to sue the school and essentially force you to lose your job and go through all kinds of other legal unpleasantness. And I think that when you look at those types of laws, you can see how the drag ban is of a piece with that, right? In two different ways. I think the first way is that so far the drag bans have been couched in the language of protecting children. Same with the book bans, same with the Don't Say Gay laws, right? The Tennessee ban tried to insert a drag ban into the existing law barring obscenity or indecency aimed at minors. So they tried to, the Republicans in that state essentially tried to tweak that law to say, okay, well, we have all these prohibitions against showing indecent and obscene things to minors. We're just going to add what the bill calls male or female impersonation to that list. So it's this idea that, okay, well, we have to protect the children by shielding them from drag. And then on the other side of it, the goal, of course, in the long run is to not only prevent drag performers from expressing themselves, but to prevent children from seeing drag. And I think the obvious reason why is that Tennessee Republicans want to suppress not just the expression of drag, but the ideas behind drag. The idea that people who are assigned male at birth can go on stage wearing, stereotypically or traditionally female attire or exaggerated female attire to express a kind of feminine view, to perform in a way that plays on gender roles, that sort of has fun with gender stereotypes, and vice versa, of course, for people assigned female at birth who decide they want to, act as drag kings in any kind of performance, parade, pride festival, whatever. The Republicans in Tennessee say, we don't want kids to see that because we don't want them to think that's acceptable. We don't even want them to know it's permissible. We want our children to be acting out their assigned stereotyped gender roles. And we are afraid of them being exposed to any kind of expression that might lead them to believe that there are other ways to be a man, to be a woman, to be trans, to be gay, to be whatever. And so I do think it all really links up there in that sort of foundational desire that Ron DeSantis will just come out and say at his press conferences, that he doesn't want kids being exposed to this speech because he doesn't think they should be able to learn and hear about and internalize these ideas because they are dangerous. And that, among many other problems, is exactly what the Supreme Court has told us the First Amendment prohibits. And so I do think it's quite interesting that a party that constantly talks about the importance of free speech, at least when it comes to posting transphobic stuff on Twitter, is also launching a nationwide campaign to suppress free speech when it comes to any kind of expression about gender and sexuality.
Mark, I think that's really astute. And I wanted to push back a little on your idea that the Republican right is entirely opposed to, drag, quad drag, because one of the, there's been 14 states where these bills have appeared. It has only passed in one, which is Tennessee, and the law is currently blocked by a federal court. And in Tennessee, one of the sort of controversies surrounding this bill, which was, thank God, very abundantly controversial, was that there were photos of Tennessee's Republican governor in drag in high school. I believe he dressed as a cheerleader at like a Powder Puff football game, right? And, we have kind of abundant examples of right-wing men donning women's clothing. There's like a very famous video of Rudy Giuliani in drag. And so there is a degree to which these sort of forces of gender revanchism and even those who would, author and push these gender expression bans do partake of this themselves, right? So I'm wondering a little bit what's the difference? What do they see as a difference? What's the functional difference? Susan?
Yeah. Well, so that was exactly the point that I wanted to jump in on, and that I think the way the laws are worded in such a vague way, and that there isn't a clear definition of what constitutes drag, is not an oversight on their part. It's actually a functional part of the way these sorts of laws work, because they're not. As you're pointing out, it's not so much a question of somebody assigned male at birth is wearing feminine attire. It's just it's targeting particular people. It's perfectly fine for a white conservative person to go, ha ha ha, it's a Powder Puff football game, isn't this funny? it's like they don't care because they receive it in a particular way. It's like the vagueness of the law is precisely what allows vulnerable populations to be targeted by selective enforcement of a law. You know, I often cite that quip from, you know, Moliere, you know, back in the, you know, whatever that was, 17th or 18th century. He says the law in its majesty forbids kings and commoners alike from sleeping under bridges and begging for food in the streets. You know, and so you criminalize something, it puts a capacity for the state powers to act coercively against vulnerable populations. It's not enforced against people who hold the reins of power. It's a, you know, a completely punitive exercise of the law on the part of one part of the population against another part of the population. There's nothing imagined there as being, you know, about equality and justice or consistency or fairness. It is interesting to me, though, that in Tennessee, that they're trying to insert drag into the obscenity laws, because if you look back into the 19th century, the first wave of anti-cross-dressing legislation in the US really starts in the 1840s and starts picking up in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And all of those laws were municipal ordinances. There was no state level ordinance anywhere that we know of. And that all of those ordinances, you know, the thing that seems interesting about it to me, it's like they were put in place for a variety of different reasons, but always in the context of cities that were experiencing rapid immigration, rapid demographic change, highly transitory populations, and you saw local elites trying to define public morality in a particular way that kept them in power. And you saw the anti-cross-dressing laws being inserted into previously existing language that, you know, basically says, like, you know, these are the things that are indecent in public. It's like no swearing and no nudity and no public drunkenness, and you can't stand on the street corner and solicit sex. And then they would often insert this phrase: you cannot appear in public in a dress belonging, in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. There's a great book on this topic by Claire Sears called Arresting Dress, if you want to really get down into the weeds of that history. But what Claire's work shows is how these cross-dressing laws often were not enforced, in a general sense, but that they were always on hand and ready to be used against people who were perceived by the powers that be as somehow disrupting public space. I can say a little bit more about that history later in the conversation if there's time, because there's a great story about how the cross-dressing laws in Memphis, I don't know about Nashville or Knoxville, but there was a really telling case about how the passage of anti-cross-dressing laws in Memphis in the 1860s had later consequences for the way the presidential election of 1876 played out. And we've got time, I'd love to tell that story, but love to hear from Jack or Marquise now.
Yeah, Jack, I know that you have to leave at the top of the hour, just so our audience knows that Jack has another engagement. So we've got them for just like a precious amount of time. But Marquise, I wanted to bring you in on this point because you look like you had something to say.
Yeah,
That Susan was bringing in about the history.
Yeah, absolutely. 'Cause I'm glad that you brought up, Susan, the notion of power and who is targeted by these things, because it does oftentimes seem selective. Because I think absolutely, Moira, you're right that there are these other instances in which people are we might call performing drag, or we might call cross-dressing, whatever language we want to use. So I think there's something about the quotidian here that when this politician or that politician did powder puff in high school or something like that, that can be siloed out, that can be compartmentalized as not quotidian of this person's life. And I think that's often too why the language surrounding like queer or trans or non-binary youth, for example, when they're coming out to their parents, I think that's often why the language of this is a phase is often used, because that's a way to make this a particular instance that's not characteristic of one's life and livelihood. Also why I think the language of lifestyle often comes up in these two. There's something about the quotidian that I think is pretty relevant here. So I wonder then the ways that, or I wonder about the mechanisms by which something is deemed as quotidian or content or characteristic of someone and not someone else. How are certain kinds of transgressions understood as characteristic of or constitutive of one's very personhood or not? So I think perhaps there's something there that also needs to be thought about, because when it is deemed as quotidian, that's when it's deemed as potentially harming children. We can absolutely talk more about children and youth and all that kind of stuff. But when it is quotidian, that's when it's talked about as potentially harming people, quote unquote harming people, because it's seen as something that is a feature of someone inhabiting the world and thus able to corrupt, let's say, other people who are unsuspecting and things like that. There's something there, I think.
Jack?
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would want to say here is we also can't tell this history only through the law. Like the law is a particular record of official actions that are either taken or that people attempt to take. But in the book that Susan references, which is the perfect reference for this conversation, Sears had to look into anti-prostitution laws, for example, to even find some reference to what were then understood as problem bodies. And, you know, and in the contemporary context, like I know of a case, I was just in Oklahoma this week, and I know that they had some drag events last year on campus. And, you know, it wasn't the law that shut down those drag events, which, by the way, were by cisgendered men having a good time and doing it for, I believe that it was a fundraiser and a good time was had by all. Instead, the university quietly closed the office that had hosted the drag event. Do you know what I mean? Like, there doesn't have to be a law for things to happen. And when we're only paying attention to the law in a way, we're not seeing some of the texture of the ways in which certain kinds of attitudes are being enforced. And they're being enforced very much in these other institutional contexts in a top-down manner, and in a way that, as I was saying earlier, is completely out of sync with how students feel at the moment about gender variance. And I think that it's true, as you know, Mark's saying that you know, partly the fear of drag is that these conservative lawmakers and parents don't understand why their kids, who they have raised to be Christians and conservatives, seem to be becoming queer, you know, and they're like, you didn't get this from us. Where did you get it? You must have gotten it from your university. And so the war on drag is of a piece with the war on the university, the war on, you know, the war on other sites where conservatives believe that lefties are winning some sort of ideological battle. So I think we always need to broaden out a little bit here, and not just ask about the specificity of drag. Drag is nested within a whole set of, you know, social fears that conservatives have right now.
This is an excellent point, and this is something I want to ask Mark about this, like, sort of broader right-wing push, not just against like queer and trans people, but also against sort of pluralist democracy more generally. Like, how do you see these attacks on drag in the context of the like right-wing push against, you know, a pluralist society?
So one of my favorite examples of the intersection of some of the issues that we're talking about is that Missouri, some years back, enacted a voter ID law at the same time that it barred trans people from changing the gender on their license. And this had the effect of essentially prohibiting a number of trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people in the state from voting because their IDs did not match them in gender and appearance and anything. The Missouri Supreme Court at the time was more progressive and struck down the law and expressly talked about that. But I think it's hard to find a better example of the intersectionality of these problems. That was one especially egregious case where a state was trying to say trans people can't vote. But I think this stuff comes in less obvious clothing as well. So much of what the Republican Party is doing right now to suppress the vote is intertwined with its assaults on Zoomers, on the youth, on young people who believe in expansive gender expression, who believe in LGBTQ equality. There was recently some leaked footage of a Republican politician complaining that, it was too easy for students to vote in college, that they could just roll out of bed and go downstairs and cast a ballot, and then it had to be made harder. In Florida, some years back, there was a huge federal case in the courts because the governor had tried to ban polling places on college campuses. Go to any college campus, even in a red state, you will see all manner of people. As Jack was mentioning, they are not boomer zones. There are places for experimentation, for progressive thinking. Even I think some students who would identify as conservative do not share these incredibly hostile views, even if when they get in the voting booth, they vote for people who do. And so I do think that the broader assault on democracy and on representation is a key part of this attack on LGBTQ people's ability not only to live, but to elect people who represent their views and to enact laws that protect them. I mean, just look at what's going on in Montana right now. The first transgender legislator, the only transgender legislator, barred from participating in the legislative process, barred from representing her constituents on the floor, barred from participating in debate, forced to sit on a bench outside of the legislature and cast her vote via Zoom. And why? Because she dared to speak out against a viciously anti-trans bill. The response from Republicans in that case was to just say, well, she's not allowed to do this anymore. She's not allowed to participate in the legislative process to protect her own constituents and the interests that they're raising. And again, hard to think of a better example of how when there is pushback here, when there is an effort to change these laws, to knock some of these anti-trans lawmakers out of office or to diminish their power, the response is not to, modify or alter these anti-LGBTQ views, but to try to stop people from voting and to try to stop people from participating in the legislature. And I think that is also of a piece of this broader suppression of expression that we've been talking about. This is a war on ideas. This is a war on democracy and representation. And if folks who don't care about drag think that they're totally immune from this and that none of this stuff is ever going to be a problem for them, I think they are quite wrong.
Jack, do you want to jump in? Or Susan? Or Mark?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. So just to second what Jack was saying about how the focus on the law is not enough, because what's really pernicious about what's happening right now is this collusion between the law, between extrajudicial and vigilante kinds of violence, between people who have their hands on the levers of administrative power, who are doing bureaucratic maneuvers that enact a kind of administrative violence against vulnerable populations. And these questions about the shift in the generational shift, I also think is incredibly important here. That's the way that I see it is that whether or not a lot of younger people feel that they are queer or trans or non-binary or what have you, is that there's just a growing recognition in the young adult generation right now an opposition to the idea of a compulsorily assigned gender binary that is rooted in a biological difference. There has been a sea change. Just go like, well, like that doesn't have anything to do with like how I like to dress or what pronouns I want to use. And so there has been a sea change. And I think that for older generations, we have so deeply internalized and naturalized these beliefs about what biological difference means and how they're supposed to be perceivable on the skin of your body and in your appearance. It's like that's what's being challenged. And I think trans in particular is really challenging, because what transness manifests and demonstrates is that it is actually possible to live in excess of what the dominant culture tells you your body is supposed to mean, that these categories that are supposed to be permanent, like gravity or something, just like are not in fact carved into our flesh, that there's something that is changeable about it. And the idea that the very way that we live our bodies in community with other people is something that is changeable and revisable, and that we could do better than what has been bequeathed to us in the past. That's what's incredibly threatening to the powers that be. Again, to second what other people have said, I think there's so much quote unquote intersectionality happening right now about the kinds of reactionary movements that we're seeing. It's like, yes, it's like voter suppression, it's not just voter suppression of trans people because of changes in ID documents. It's like a much vaster problem with voter suppression of Black voters in the South. It's not just freedom of expression, it's about freedom of assembly, with the First Amendment rights. It's like they're going after like drag in pride parades in Florida. It's basically saying who can be a member of the body public, the body politic, who can exist in public space. Who can be visible in public space. It's like trans issues and drag issues are not unrelated to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It's like, it's all about bodily autonomy. It's all about, who gets to say what your body is for. And so, I get to echo what was said earlier. It's like, if you thought you didn't care about drag, it's just a canary in a coal mine for a broader set of interrelated issues that really affect all of us in some way, shape, form, or fashion.
Susan, I think that's brilliant and so insightful. And you mentioned earlier that the 1840s is when these first bans on like cross-dressing or like public transgenderism started to emerge. And that's also, of course, when the first bans on abortion began to be introduced right in the middle of that big immigration push. And I also wanted to return to what Mark brought up, which was the question of Zooey Zephyr, this state legislator in Montana who has been sort of banned from participating as unequal in terms of mutual respect with her colleagues as part of a disservice to her constituents, because her situation in Montana looks very much like the situation of two young Black men who were state legislators in Tennessee. They're both named Justin, who were expelled and then quite quickly reintegrated into the state legislature. And in both these cases, with Zooey in Montana and the two Justins in Tennessee, they were sanctioned for seeming to be too quote unquote unruly. They breached decorum. They sort of insulted the proclivities of their colleagues, supposedly. And I wanted to think about this question of trans citizenship and gender instability in public, and maybe kind of bring that a little bit back to the history, because Susan, you mentioned that these are unstable categories that are they collapse on close inspection and are really being, as Jack mentioned, increasingly disregarded by younger people, right? And I wanted to also note that these are categories that have been historically contingent and like sort of redefined and differently understood throughout history. So Marcus, could you like maybe bring us in a little and talk about how, you know, these concepts of what it requires to be a public participant have like maybe changed over time, and how they have, you know, not always been as stable as the contemporary right like might like to pretend.
That was me, right?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah. I think what I want to say is, what do I want to say? In terms of what it, I guess for me, it's a question of what is, I think it's two questions. What is permitted to exist in, or what is permitted to be legible on the social terrain, as well as what are the kind of constituent, perhaps even implicit criteria for entry into social interaction. I think those two things often are operating here. And so with those two things, I think there's, of course, we can talk about intersectionality in the ways that race is linked to gender and linked to class and all that kind of stuff. We can have that conversation, but I think what I want to try to suggest, I guess, on at least the ways that, say, various kinds of populations have been written out of the body politic, written out of sociality. I think what I want to get at is a sense that the criteria by which one enters into sociality, those criteria are laden with various kinds of assumptions. Those assumptions, I think, are very much instantiations of normativity. So when one enters and by virtue of entering, transgresses that normativity, enacts a kind of non-normativity, I think that is when the kind of social, or the imagined social fabric, begins to dissolve or begins to fracture. And that happens in a variety of different kinds of ways. So when we think about citizenship, for example, we can understand by virtue of someone who is quote unquote supposed to be a citizen in this country, then is treated uncitizenly. Then we get a kind of glimpse into the ways that the very notion of citizenship operates operates on certain kinds of assumptions. Those assumptions are deeply normative. So I think the link then is, what are the assumptions that are undergirding what it means to enter into the social space? What are the assumptions that undergird what it means to be a proper subject in public? And I think those are the things that really tie all of this together, those assumptions, those normative assumptions, which then work to discipline and police what's permitted to exist in social space, and I guess also in private space as well, because we can think about the ways that the assumption of what it means to exist in public in a certain way then indexes kinds of private interaction behaviors, et cetera, which are then kind of try to be legislated out of existence, et cetera. So I think in short, then, I'm incredibly interested in what it means to, by virtue of one's action, behaviors, inhabitation, body, identity, et cetera, what it means to then exceed or move outside of those normative assumptions, and how those things supervene along various kinds of, I'm not even going to say identity vectors, because they oftentimes exceed the very limits of identity. So what does it mean when one's very existence fractures what it means to properly exist? And I think that is a kind of thread amongst all of the different, of course, but still nonetheless quite similar ways that people are written out of, or attempted to be written out of public discourse, of social interaction, of sociality, of relationality, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, Susan will know more about this really, but the history of drag has always meant different things, and it has often been a vector for the expression of social anxiety about either minoritarian subjects or often women. So, for example, drag, you know, the history of drag goes back to the time when women were not allowed to be on the stage. In, for example, Shakespearean theatre, you couldn't have women on the stage, and therefore men played those roles, you know, and And that's about the division between public and private. And drag is an expression of this sense of the way in which women have to be consigned to the private. So it's not the case that drag is everywhere and always a representation or a performance of an actual queer community. Now, by the time you get to the Victorian period, there are a bunch of male impersonators. The best known is Vesta Tilley, who was a big deal on the Victorian stage and had massive numbers of fans and was sort of openly gay. And then, of course, Oscar Wilde makes theatre the centerpiece of the picture of Dorian Gray and of a particular understanding of queerness that goes through the theatre and through performance in a way that puts into question the relationship between nature and human embodiment. So those, those are touchstones. If you look at the history of Gladys Bentley, by the time you get to the 30s and 40s, and this is a big chapter in Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Gladys Bentley was a blues singer who performed in what we might look back and say was drag, but for him, may not have been drag. He was actually quite happy at that point in his life before he received intense pressure to live as a woman. He performed as a man, and so did Ma Rainey. So did a whole bunch of blues performers for whom the nightclub was an opportunity to express something that was outside of the bounds of not only a gender system, but also a racial system that enforced gender norms, very brutally on Black populations. So drag is often many different things. By the time you get to the 1990s, when there's a massive drag king scene suddenly, then you suddenly see battle lines being drawn between trans people who are like, we're not in drag, and then the drag kings who are like, I am doing drag. I'm actually, take my mustache off. I'm actually a woman, right? So there are a lot of different adjacent battles in the 1990s. So drag is not one thing. It's it's sort of silly in a way to make a unified history of drag, because as even that ridiculous little synopsis shows, drag means many, many different things. I think what currently conservatives see when they see drag is the possibility that their kids will know through RuPaul's drag show or through the drag queen reading at their local library, the kid will know that this whole narrative about mommy and daddy and Adam and Eve actually has it does not apply for large parts of the world. And that's what the drag show or the drag queen represents in that context. But we're asking drag to do an enormous amount of work here, even on this panel, by talking about a war on drag. We clearly all think the war is on a lot of other things.
Yeah, and let me just jump in quickly, since it's connected to what Jack and Marquise have just been saying, but I do want to hear from Mark too, that drag is as Jack was just saying, it's like what we're actually talking about is a lot of different things here. It's like when we say drag, what do you actually mean by that? It's like, and for me, drag is connected to, it's like comes out of a subcultural vernacular. It is related to like urban queer subcultures. It's related to performance, and that it's not a synonym for like all kinds of cross-dressing, all kinds of theatrical performance. And as Jack was saying, it's like there's long histories of theatrical cross-dressing that's just considered part of the art form. And actually well into the 20th century in the US, theatrical gender impersonation, sometimes just called gender personation, which I kind of like that version. It wasn't like a false presentation. It was just personifying something. That it really wasn't until the 1920s that you start to see in what kids today on the internet might call normie culture. It's like that the normies were all figuring out that there was something that could be considered queer about drag. They just thought it was, like Vesta Tilley or Julian Elton, on the stage on Broadway. They just marveled over the technical accomplishment of being able to create an appearance or an illusion, but that it was, if we followed some of George Chauncey's historical work, it was during Prohibition when you had more and more straight people who were just like, you know, wanting to go have a cocktail after the show, who get more acclimated to a criminalized urban nightlife, and they're starting to see queer drag performance, you know, when things that are coming out of that scene, like the so-called pansy craze or some of Mae West's, you know, theatrical shows and movies, it's like that's when drag kind of breaks into the mainstream, and a lot of straight people are going like, oh, there's something queer about that. It's like, that's not wholesome family entertainment anymore.
Yeah, I think this is a
Important
great.
to just mention Esther Newton's book as well, along with Chauncey's. Yeah, because Esther Newton's book, Mother Camp, is the first sociological study of the drag show, and breaks the drag show down in terms of both who's performing and who the audience is. And that very much corresponds to the history that Susan just gave us.
Yeah, 100%.
I think this is a wonderful point that, you know, this is actually a very capacious and sort of ill-defined category that encompasses a lot of like different kinds of motivations and behaviors. And this goes back to Susan's point at the top of the panel about how, you know, the very vague wording of these drag ban bills allows for a kind of selective enforcement of a vast swath of sort of disfavored populations. But before we have to switch to the Q&A, and we have some wonderful questions lined up because we have a lovely audience, but we do have to say goodbye to Jack in just a few minutes. So I wanted to quickly ask you guys, where do you see the possibilities for resistance, or for you know, maybe even a kind of, you know, solidarity among these different people who are targeted by this new anti-trans and anti-queer push?
Maybe I'll say something because I have to go, and I mean this, you know, I want to not seem disrespectful to my co-panelists. I'm really sorry that I have to leave. We're in the last week here, and 2 events got scheduled incorrectly. But I think that Marquise was you know, giving us a sense, and so was Susan a moment ago, that there's lots of solidarity that comes out of the actual subcultural worlds of drag, number one. But number two, this is the moment for those of us who are queer and perverse and who are committed to thinking differently about the political, and you know, recognize that these political systems that we inhabit are absolutely inadequate, people who are thinking in terms of abolition and other things. This is the moment for much broader coalitions, so that yes, we want to talk about the war on drag, but as we are all doing here today, we recognize that it's of a piece with a war on poor people, war on young people. It's of a piece with incarceration, and so on. And we need massive coalitions right now that are queer and feminist and abolitionist in order to really, you know, do battle. And I'm really happy we had this conversation about drag, recognizing that this is just the beginning. This is just a kind of opening. And one thing to say to the person who was saying the discussion is very academic, yeah, but you know, academia is the place where a lot of these ideas get generated, and this is actually what the right are worried about. They're worried about academia. So let's have more academic discussions, is what I would say.
I can chime in really quickly. Thank you for that last point, Jack. I appreciate that very much. In terms of resistance, I'll share in terms of resistance and solidarity, a quick story. So I've been doing prison education for, oh goodness, 6.5 years now. And I'm teaching a class this semester, and I'm teaching a class on gender and Black masculinity for a population of incarcerated people. I have 13 students, 12 of whom are understood as Black men. And we were actually reading an article, which is a phenomenal article called Unwarranted and Invasive Scrutiny by Aaron Pastor on Caster Semenya. we were reading that article, and that article was talking about a whole bunch of things, but in particular about the way that Caster Semenya, as a Black South African track runner, was being scrutinized, and in like her body is invaded in a whole bunch of ways with testing and all that kind of, and the deeply queer-phobic language surrounding her athleticism and all that kind of stuff. And then one of my students, because the article talked about what are kind of colloquially called the nude parades, that in particular, women athletes are put through in order to verify their femininity or verify that they are women, especially at the Olympic level. And one of my students was noting the ways that that at least in his understanding, that was precisely what was happening in the antebellum era in the U.S. And the ways that enslaved Black people were paraded around and then bought and sold, and the way that their bodies were scrutinized and all that kind of stuff. So we can talk about the distinction and nuances between that. But I think the aim here and what he said afterward was like, this allows me to get a deeper sense of like the kinds of struggles that other people are going through, and how then I can be a kind of attentive to those things, because, and this is his word, this same system is fucking both of us over. So how can we both then be thinking about how we might stop fighting one another, or stop trying to think about who's more oppressed than whom, or rather we have a common enemy, essentially. So I think when we're thinking then about the ways that various populations are being marginalized, oppressed, harmed, killed, etc., what are the systems in place that have made those kinds of things sensible and possible to do to various populations? And it's oftentimes a kind of select group or a select kind of system that doles out its violences toward many populations. So how, instead of thinking about what Audre Lorde might call the oppression Olympics, instead of thinking about that, how can we in fact think about coalition along various kinds of strata, various kinds of harms and oppressions, and then think about how we might end the systems that are doling out those oppressions, rather than thinking about this is my oppression and I want to emphasize that rather than you and your oppression. Think about the various ways that that very similar systems are doing the harm amongst many kinds of people. So I think that's one way to think about coalition, is the language that I often use, to think about coalition with respect to resistance and with respect to something like solidarity.
Thank you.
I just want to bite off a little piece of this before we go to Q&A, which is the effort to drive a stake between gay and bisexual people and trans and gender nonconforming people while we're talking about coalitions and solidarity. Obviously, this is a really important issue. I know that you've done a panel on it in the past. There's the issue of TERFs, of trans exclusionary radical feminists, who are trying to argue that the trans movement and trans inclusivity is offensive to women, that it's sexist and misogynistic. There's also, I fear, a growing movement of primarily like cis white gay men who are pushing to kind of cordon themselves off from the rest of the community, of the LGBTQ community, and especially to adopt transphobic views. This is like a really big thing in my home state, for better or worse, of Florida. I call them homo fascists. There's like a really large community of DeSantis supporting homo fascists in Florida, who one of their number one principles is that trans people do not belong in the coalition, that they do not deserve support or legal recognition or anything, and that the mere existence of trans people is offensive, and that sometimes, though not always, carries over to a hatred of drag, even though drag has been a big part of of gay male communities for a very long time. And, you know, I just think there are many ways to approach this. We don't have time to discuss most of them here, but any gay person who thinks that the people persecuting trans people are going to stop with trans people, they're absolutely delusional. And one of the most obvious reasons for that is, as we've all been discussing on this panel, you know, one of the big issues for conservatives right now is the idea of non-conforming gender expression, of behaving in a way that doesn't align with traditional gender stereotypes. And for many years, that was the prevailing view of gay people as well. And that actually came up in a lot of the gay rights cases. That gay people are essentially, when they are persecuted for their sexuality, they're being persecuted for not meeting the stereotypes that are associated with men and women. Men marry women, women marry men behave a certain masculine way, women behave a certain feminine way. I think that homophobia, transphobia, hatred of drag, all of the pathologies that we've been discussing today really spring forth from the same diseased root. And I find it very concerning to see that there is this, I fear, growing movement to lop off the T, as some people say, to separate LGB and T, because people can try to convince themselves that's possible, but the people who are committed to oppressing and persecuting the LGBTQ community do not feel that way. They feel that we're all one and the same, and the same people who are designing laws to target trans people today will be designing laws to target gay people tomorrow, even rich cis white gay people in Florida.
Thanks, Mark. That's an excellent reminder. Susan, can you take us out before we move on to Q&A?
Sure. I mean, just seconding everything that everybody has said so far, particularly what Marquise was saying about how do you not do your advocacy in politics based on a narrow notion of an identity, but like thinking about the commonalities across different communities and populations that are marginalized, oppressed, and targeted by the same systems of power. And so to me, like, that is the essence of a queer politics. If you look at where the word queer started to be popularized, 30 some odd years ago, it was about the coalition of people coming together who were all impacted by the HIV/AIDS crisis, whether you were a Haitian immigrant or a person with hemophilia, or whether you were a white gay man. It's just like the idea of a coalition of people who shared something where you were against the same thing, and I think that we need to have much more of that kind of coalitional politics around everything that is happening to us now, not just drag and anti-trans or ginning up controversies about children, but about reproductive choice, bodily autonomy, anti-racism, anti-democracy, stomping on the hydra-headed beast of nativist fascism in this country. It's like we need to be coming together as a community of people who are opposed to all of that, regardless of what our particular stake in opposing that is. Just one quick thing to end when you asked the question about what kinds of so I wrote it down here. It's like possibilities of resistance. I know as a historian that the use of drag or cross-gender dressing has often been a form of political protest, so like the Luddites, or people who were involved in urban rioting in the 17th or 18th century. That there's been a long tradition of using drag as a form of disruptive popular politics. I also know that that when those cross-dressing laws that had been on the books since the 19th century were first being legally overturned in the 1960s, that a lot of it was because of the unenforceability of those laws. I mean, not just courts starting to throw it out because of violations of First Amendment rights to freedom of expression, but because of the way that popular mores about gendered appearance were beginning to change in the context of the 60s counterculture, that you'd have cops bringing trans women in, arresting them for cross-dressing because they were wearing, pants that, buttoned, in the wrong, direction, or they didn't have zippers in them. It's like that that it was kind of becoming culturally impossible to say, well, what's drag or what's cross-gender dressing and what's just today's fashion. Is a man wearing a paisley print blouse cross-dressing, or is he just a hippie? And so I think today, I think there could be a really powerful form of political resistance where people who are not trans, who don't do drag, but who are politically aligned with it, it's like strategically or tactically cross-dress as protest in certain kinds of public spaces, or that there could be a way that there is a way that enforcing these new laws just becomes impossible because of the way that masses of people are conducting themselves in a quotidian, day-to-day way for an expressed political purpose. So I'll stop there and
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you. We had to say goodbye to Jack. Jack was a wonderful part of the panel as well. And I think we're going to move on to the wonderful questions from our audience. So I'm going to start with this question from Sam Del Castillo. We are in a unique time in which the possibilities of changing our bodies / embodiment are perhaps more expansive than ever before. Could you speak on what that does to the imagination of people? Does this help create / bring about new feelings, e.g. dysphoria, that were experienced differently in the past? What is our relationship to all these questions? Anybody?
Oh, okay, I'll just quickly, even though I just spoke. It's like, so I do think that biotechnology, as well as new kinds of telecommunications, digital media, it really does change our cultural understanding of the relationship between the physicality of our bodies and how we think about ourselves and how we're socially categorized. It's like that is one of the drivers that is creating this sea change. But I would also just want to say that well before medicalized body changing technologies have been in place, it's like there were people who, to use today's lingo, were assigned as one sex who lived as a different gender. It's like that has been persistent since before some of the medical options that are available today were available. And I kind of want to decouple that the question of like it's yes, capacities for bodily change, I think, do drive what we're seeing at some level, and we can't reduce the trans and drag questions to possibilities for somatic transformation. I think they're two different things.
This might take us a little bit from the question, but I just want to talk about the ways that these medical advances have opened up new fields of treatment for children, especially for young people who experience gender dysphoria, and how that has led to a lot of lives saved, a lot of families improved, a lot of really great care for young people, and yet also a lot of backlash in all of these states that have tried to ban gender affirming care for youth. States like Texas that have sent child protective services to people's houses, threatening to take their children away because they allowed them to get gender-related care. And I mean, I think it's so perverse to see this backlash in part because actually we in this country have been performing gender-related surgery on young people for a very long time. When babies are born intersex, until very recently, it was the standard of care to somewhat arbitrarily assign them one gender or another and to perform surgery that may not actually align with the gender that they are and the gender that they grow up to be. And I think it's really troubling that that practice was completely unquestioned for decades. It was assumed that, of course, parents could forcibly assign intersex babies one gender or another. But when there comes a treatment that in many cases is reversible, where young people who do know their gender, who want to and can consent to gender-related treatment are seeking it out, states suddenly rush in to ban that. And I think it's really notable that every single law that has been passed so far that bans gender-affirming care for young people exempts genital surgeries for intersex babies. And so I think that the way that we have sort of moved in this direction is there have been wonderful medical advances that have opened a lot of people's eyes to the way that we can advance human rights for young people especially, but for all kinds of people. That has drawn backlash. And it feels to a lot of people like it's this crazy new step in medical treatment, when it's really not. It's just a much better, more caring, more thoughtful way of helping young people affirm their genders, and not what we used to do, which is randomly assign a gender and try to lock them into it at birth. So, you know, the medical advances are miraculous in many ways. There's always going to be backlash to progress, but I do think we're moving in the right direction. And those who can't see that are really locked into, I think a very unfortunate and in a lot of ways harmful model of how we deal with young people who don't present specifically as one gender or another.
Yeah, I think, Mark, your point is well taken, that, you know, a lot of these sort of tactics that, or like treatments that have been taken up by, you know, people treating trans patients or by trans patients themselves to sort of destabilize these categories and hierarchies of gender have actually been used to reify them in the past. And there's, you know, quite different responses to those two projects. And I think this also like brings us back to Marquise's point about like destabilization and ambiguity as being these like very, very, you know, sort of emotion provoking points. And I think, you know, a lot of the people in the Q&A, like several different questions, all have come back to Marquise's comments about performance and the quotidian, and the idea of a kind of drag or transgender gender expression being either like in the daily life or in this like state of exception. So I'm going to read kind of a representative question from anonymous attendee. Responding to Marquise's insightful comments, wouldn't drag also be considered as separate from, quote, quotidian? If a person is temporary cross-dressing for a particular show, wouldn't this be the same as a governor cross-dressing for a powder puff event? And Marquise, do you have any thoughts about like on what these distinctions are, where there's commonalities?
Yeah, you would think that yeah, this feels like a kind of maybe not a one-off event, but an event that has much less fuzzy boundaries, and that this is happening in this time span, and then after that, this is no longer or less so the case for me. So a performance at a powder puff game or a performance at a drag show, you would think that these are not understood as quotidian. But I think what the distinction is that there is so for example, someone doing powder puff, I think there's a way that that's understood in a context of this is a kind of this is not expressive of me, but I'm doing this for this externalized thing. Whereas with drag performance, I think it's often assumed to index something essential about a person. And also I think there's a way that perhaps dressing up for, say, or dressing as a cheerleader for a powder puff game is understood as also this sense of this has a different kind of history. Whereas with drag, there is, I think, an assumption there that this is indexical, or rather that this constitutes one's very being, that I have a certain relationship to gender such that this is something that I want to do, seek to do, and also I think there's an assumption that this has happened before and this will happen again. I think with a powder puff game, for example, or with other kinds of instances, it's a kind of this is a special or spectacular event. This is at a party or a football game or something like that. Whereas perhaps with drag, it's assumed as something that's much more constant in one's life. But you would think that these things would occupy quite similar things. And I wonder if other folks have a sense of where another distinction might lie. But I think that there's one thing with respect to transgressing gender in a way that feels like it is like it's something that is constitutive of who one is rather than a one-off event.
Yeah, I would second that, and it's the ideas that you were getting at there, part of what I was trying to express early on about the distinction between what they're calling drag and what they're calling, like, or not calling, but like the distinction between a drag performance, like at a drag queen story hour at a library, versus the governor of the state of Tennessee, like dressing up at a powder puff football game, is that for me, what's at stake is what is the body that the practice is pointing towards. It's like, and so I think about a Australian colleague, Joseph Pugliese, who does work on critical race and whiteness studies. And he has this concept of what he calls prosthetic citizenship. And that, under, neoliberal conditions, and particularly neoliberal identity politics, the idea that you can expand and contract citizenship at will, like you can lop off the T, as somebody said, or you can decide, oh, that doesn't apply to Muslims or what have you, that expansive and contractive sense of which identities are imagined as belonging to the nation, belonging to the body politic, is not fixed. It's always tactical. It always serves some other interest. But that Joseph's point is that kind of at the heart of it all, it's like the body whose place in the body politic is not being questioned is the white masculinist heteronormative subject. And it's like, and that body is not being questioned. I mean, perhaps some of the cultural politics are about people who want to dislodge that as the social norm or the social dominant, and that's precisely why those people are more reactive and resistant to change. But that the governor of Tennessee putting on a cheerleader outfit at a powder puff football game, it doesn't do anything that destabilizes the fact that his body has been like positioned as quite central to these dominant cultural notions of who is the normative body of the body politic. Whereas when you do it as drag, it's like the very same practice. It's just another way of saying those people are people we don't think should actually be part of the public sphere. They should not be citizens of the nation. They should not have the same rights. They're not welcome. In fact, they're defective, they're degenerate, they're a danger, and we need to eliminate them or suppress them. It's like, and so what's at stake is not the practice itself, it's the way the practice itself points to a certain kind of positionality of the body that's doing it.
Susan, that's such a good point, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about it a lot because, in this, we've sort of discussed a few times, come back to this concept of like the differences in the contents of drag performances, and like something that's very, or seems clear to me about like the Tennessee governor's powder puff cheerleader outfit is that he's not actually he was not at that moment as that like high school boy looking to like destabilize or problematize this like false stability of gender, right? What he was doing was contrasting the dignity of his central white male heterosexual body with like the supposed indignity of the cheerleader outfit, right? Like that
or you could even imagine it as a kind of like privilege or capacity that he can appear as he chooses without consequence.
Right. Right, that's not going to be something like, even in the hypocrisy of him advancing this bill, he kind of just shrugged it off and goes, well, that's not the same thing. And he's right, it's not the same thing as what he's targeting, which is, a different, more subversive kind of performance. But we have had a few of these questions about like sort of the content of various kinds of drag performances and how that content can be interpreted. So anonymous attendee asks, although I really do agree with the political critiques made here, I'm wondering what is happening with the performance aspect of drag. So far, we've been oriented toward contextual politics, but I'm wondering if we might shift the lingo a bit and delve into drag performances themselves, the worlds they enable, how we imagine drag as a form of cultural work, the history of radical socialist kinship politics in certain ballroom circles, et cetera, et cetera. How might drag help us imagine something like the Undercommons?
That's a great question. I will not attempt to answer all of it. I will just say something that came to mind as Susan was speaking is that this distinction between playing and performance is one that's enshrined in the Tennessee law that we're talking about. The Tennessee law specifically talks about performance as though there's something uniquely dangerous and threatening about performing with drag. And I think, you know, if the governor had a better lawyer, then his response to this question would have been, well, I was just having fun. I was just pretending. It's different when you're expressing something and going on stage and trying to make other people believe something about you or about what you're doing. And I think that shows that, like, one of the deepest fears here is that these performances will convey certain ideas about gender that, you know, to go back to where we started, are going to be toxic or perverse for children and going to lead them off the path of, you know, white Christian heterosexuality. And I think that other marginalized communities definitely face similar problems, definitely face similar attempts to suppress expression of their ideas, whether it's through mockery or through something, you know, different from drag, whether it's through books that get banned in a school library, whether it's through, you know, plays or TV shows. Either way, you know, there is an attempt often to express protest what society is doing, to protest the norms that are suffocating a certain group. And the state will specifically target those attempts to express that because the state realizes that's one of the most effective ways of getting a message across. And that, I just think that's been sort of running through this whole conversation, that there really is a difference between having fun as something that you're going to change out of immediately, and then actually performing in a way that's designed to get a message across. And it's that performance that the state, that the, you know, Republicans in government think that is the most dangerous thing, and that is what we have to target.
I think Mark just kind of like distilled the panel. Thank you so much for your service. So I think we have time for one more question. And I'm going to ask this one from Cypress Westberg, which I think is just really excellent. And, you know, it's straightforward. What can we do to help people being directly impacted by the transphobic legislation that is being passed? Susan, you sort of pointed to the idea of like making these laws unenforceable with like political performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that sounds like the most fun option, but, you know, I mean, just doing all of the usual things, call your representatives, show up to protest, take direct action in the streets, be supportive of people in your life who are impacted by these things, speak to people in your social circles who are perhaps more low information than you are, or have some genuine questions, and do the educational work. And to do the work of educating yourself about all of the kinds of intersectional issues that we have all been talking about today, to see many different social struggles as linked, and to not isolate the war on drag as something that just is a frivolous matter that affects a tiny minority of people.
Thanks. Marquise, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I was just about to respond. Yeah, I love all of those things, absolutely all of those things. I think also because I'm a theorist and I think philosophically and abstractly about things, I think other thing that one might do is to think about in what ways you can continue to not only be in community with people who are being targeted by these things, but how can you cultivate more livable conditions for people, even if it's just like, I mean, this person experienced a deeply trans antagonistic act. How can you invite that person into your home, talk to them, just be someone who cares about them? Because I think that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes goes kind of under notice, the ways that caring for someone or expressing a kind of generosity or compassion can allow someone literally to live. And I think that's often what we want in our politics of liberation. We want more livable conditions for people. And I think one of the small, or perhaps it's not small, but one of the ways to do that is simply cultivating a small space for that person to live a little bit more freely. So that might look like a number of things, but doing those kind of things, I think can also make a vast difference, vast difference that sometimes are not talked about a lot, in addition to these other necessary, wonderful, absolutely amazing things that Susan just shared.
Thank you. And Mark, last but not least.
Vote, organize, march in the streets, and if any of these drag bans get upheld, we're going to need some civil disobedience. Some of the shows have gotten canceled. I think that's a real shame. The show needs to go on, and the audience needs to be too big to arrest. So I know it's easy for me to say here in DC, but I really think that if this trend continues, some courageous people are going to have to step up and defend their rights here against an overbearing and increasingly authoritarian state.
Yeah, do not be afraid to riot in
Right.
any way that you need to. That is imperative oftentimes. So I love that, Mark.
Yeah, make all the good trouble you can make. You know?
On that note, thank you all so much. This went beautifully. I learned so much from all of you, and I want to send my appreciation to our panelists and to our audience. Thank you all so much for coming. All right, take care, everybody.